So I'm making this video in response to a lot of the various reactions that I saw regarding the recent political stuff that happened. Really, by observing people's reactions, I wanted to highlight the idea of Kayfabe that Eric Weinstein brought up way back when. But kind of explain how that really works in the political sense. Because as I've done somewhat of a deep dive into the world of wrestling, it's a really fascinating process, and it's not portrayed very well by a lot of people that are talking about the term. Because usually it's just kind of this thing of, oh, it's kayfabe, it's fake. That's not really what the kayfabe system was all about. So what happens with wrestling, it happens in a lot of other similar combat sports. Essentially, these things start off as legitimate. Wrestling is a sport that's supposed to test the strength of the competitors without ideally causing a lot of permanent injury, unlike boxing or something like that. But the tendency that happens in all these kind of combat sports, where essentially the people who are the best at it come to a point of compromise or understanding, sometimes with each other, often with each other, and often with the financial backers of the fights, to realize that if they can determine the outcomes in advance, they stand to profit quite a bit. Some of that might be due to betting. That's something you have to be a little bit careful of, because you can't bet on something that's completely predetermined. So this is like more typical in the world of boxing, where somebody will essentially be paid, a boxer will be paid to throw a fight. They will lose on purpose. They'll be compensated for it. Because of that, the person in the know can place a large bet and really profit off of that. And it's why you might even have somebody who tends to lose, and then you would get their opponent to throw the match because the odds will be better. Because somebody who has a pretty lousy record is going to have a better odds in terms of the return, so you might throw it that way. And there's other ways that this happens too. So from what I understand, like in sumo wrestling, it's not as well known or it's not as well picked up, but basically they kind of, somebody uncovered this by looking at the kind of statistical variance in the matches and the things. And it seemed to be that there's somewhat of a culture where new wrestlers would be expected to kind of throw matches towards the veterans in a sense to kind of extend their careers, as a means of paying dues that they would be expected to lose. So it all kind of starts with this aspect of a planned outcome. And the other benefits of this is that prevents real injury, especially when you consider the career-ending, life-ending things that can happen. Having a plan of giving the people what they want, a good show, and trying to maintain the illusion of reality is a wise practice for those involved. And most of the time, the people going to enjoy it more. Like, as an example, when the wrestling kind of thing took off, there used to be these matches that would go on for like hours and hours and hours because the guys were just really evenly matched. And it was sometimes like it was literally like 12-hour fights of these guys just going back and forth. And from a money-making standpoint, that's not a great sell. People aren't going to stay around for that. They don't have the time. And it just gets tedious. So, there's a sweet spot where it's believable and it looks right and you go through all the motions and everybody walks away happy because they've been entertained. The fight was good. There is elements of the real within it that still excite people. So, obviously, as this evolves over time, in the wrestling thing, it became much more of a promotional gimmick. And when there was before you kind of got to the part where you have like these storylines. Even in the early on, you would have storylines in the sense of like these characters would have a persona, and so it might be that you would have a company of kind of circus performers or whatever that would travel around, and they would have this face and this heel character, and they would fight each other. And sometimes they would also allow people in the audience or whatever, like local people, to participate. So here's where you kind of get into the beginning of the specialization. The term is like a hooker. So they would be called a hooker, and this was a guy who was legitimately a very good wrestler and often had some very debilitating moves that he could put on somebody. And the idea would be you go to a town and you get the local tough guy to come up into the ring and wrestle this guy. And then this guy, maybe he's like a little bit unassuming and or whatever, but he employs some trick and he legitimately beats the local tough guy. This is a guy who's a professional fighter. The odds of the local tough guy winning are very low, especially when he employs whatever tricks, were not widely known at that time, before the age of like MMA fighting and everybody going to jiu-jitsu gyms and things like that. The guy who just wrestled with his buddies in the cornfield or whatever isn't going to be able to stand up to this professional guy, the hooker. And so what happens is that he would beat the local tough guy, and then later on that guy would lose to the main, the baby face or whatever. Like, so he might be the heel. This guy that's the hooker might be the heel, or he might be the jobber, who's a jobber is the guy that loses to the main wrestlers. Basically, it's the no-name wrestler who loses to the main characters on purpose. And, what that does is that provides the legitimacy, because then the tough guy says, this guy, he beat the crap out of me. If this is legit, because then he sees that guy losing to the famous guy, and so by extension, that guy is an even better fighter. So no way could the local tough guy beat Mr. Babyface. As this thing develops and it, spreads out to a wider audience, when you get to the time of like television promotions, the key is maintaining this facade, this whole story-based thing. And obviously with wrestling, it's very elaborate and it's kind of silly, that there's just always these wrestlers having these feuds in these ways. And so that's obviously the fact where everybody knew that there was a fictional element of it, but it depended on how outlandish they would make these things. Because when it was more or less storylines based on just who is a better wrestler and who has a feud with someone else, and the characters weren't as gimmicky, it was a lot more believable. But essentially, once the match is over, the guys are shaking hands and they're drinking together and they're counting their winnings in the same room. So that the fiction ends in that regard. So as the public personas of these individuals became more well known and widespread, the need to maintain the sort of fictional narrative expanded. And that's really when the whole kayfabe concept really comes into being. Because when it was a traveling carnival show, essentially the only time they had to be on was during the hours of operation. They would just go out for these little promotional kind of things and then go back to their trailer or whatever. But once you have like characters on television, they needed to represent the whole industry in a way that would protect the secrets, essentially. And so then when you get like these famous guys like Hulk Hogan and guys who pass what they call the airport test, which is essentially that somebody who couldn't walk through an airport without being recognized. If that's the case, then part of your job as a wrestler was to be that character in all public interactions. Not even just like, when they go on talk shows, but anywhere they meet fans. They are, like Hulk Hogan was Hulk Hogan. He was not Terry Bollea. He only got to be Terry Bollea when he's like at home with his wife. and all the rest of the time, or perhaps in the locker room with the other wrestlers. And the whole way that like the word kayfabe was sometimes used is that they would essentially they would say that word when somebody who was not in on the secret would come around. They're working at some venue and I don't know, a repairman comes and does something that you say kayfabe, and then everybody knows they have to act like their in-ring persona and not whoever they really are. So they have to maintain that fiction. The whole point of this thing, remember, is to make money, and this requires some amounts of people who either willingly buy into it or are duped by the thing. In wrestling, obviously especially at this day and age, and there's always an element of it where the kid thinks it's real, the parent knows it's fake. The parent goes along with it for the sake of the kid, like Santa Claus or whatever. He's going to maintain the illusion for the kid's enjoyment. So that person who doesn't know or whatever is called the mark, and that's the person that's being duped. That's your source of revenue. So the goal is to give them a good show and all this stuff, and you sell t-shirts and action figures and all these things. Now, to maintain the success of the whole thing, they would orchestrate these complex storylines. They would orchestrate changes and things like that. And there was a sense where they had to do a good job pleasing the fans. In fact, this is their job. Their job is not necessarily to wrestle. Their job is to keep the fans from asking questions. And that means that they have to fulfill the expectations. So what that meant is that not everybody could be the champion. So with the example of Hulk Hogan was a great champion and everybody loved him or whatever. The people who paid money loved him. Some of the other people didn't always like him. Some of the other wrestlers didn't like him. But they had the Ultimate Warrior take over, but the Ultimate Warrior flopped. He didn't know how to be the champ. When he was at the top, he didn't draw the crowds. He didn't have the charismatic persona to carry the whole storyline. Even though he had huge muscles and he acted all crazy and stuff like that, he wasn't suitable for the job. And so this is where the kind of illusory aspect of it comes in, because he essentially was somebody who thought it was about one thing. If you look at his whole life, it's it took him a really long time to figure out what was going on with wrestling. First, he started off with bodybuilding, and he thought being the biggest and the strongest, this is the most important thing. Looking the part is part of the thing, but it's not the whole thing. And what he didn't understand was his job and his role, which was not to promote himself, because he wanted to be the champion. He wanted the respect. He wanted the high pay. But what he didn't understand is that him being in that role didn't serve the company. And what the good champs understand is that sometimes losing is better for the company than winning. And this is essentially where everybody kind of finds their place. Some people are the jobbers, the little no-name guys that just get beat up all the time. That is an important part of the whole thing. Other guys are like these mid-cards that can beat the jobbers, but they will always lose to the big main act kind of guys. And so everybody has their role and their place. And then everything surrounding this whole apparatus reflects that. So all the commentary talks about it as if it's real. It's fictitious commentary, and then there's the magazines that will talk about it as if it's real, and those are fictitious magazines. And so it has this whole fictional apparatus that surrounds the thing, and all that is part of the kayfabe system. But the important part is to say it's not fake, and it's not duping people. It is giving people what they want, and it's giving them what they want in a way that they expect. It's really something that's designed to fulfill expectations. And so to maintain that system, there's a couple things you have to really protect from happening. So in the first instance, let's say you have the guy who thinks he's a tough guy and he fights the WWE superstar, and he wins. Well, if he wins, then you put him in a tricky situation. So essentially what you got to do then is you have to recruit the guy into the system to get him to protect the secret. Or, and this happens in a lot of systems of control, you have to eliminate him as a threat, essentially. So in the old days, this would be a thing where somebody might actually get really hurt, injured. They would call this person like a policeman, essentially, who would take somebody out who wasn't gonna play by the rules. And this is like what the mafia does too. If you're going to, if you have evidence, they want to incriminate you. And so now we can think about what happens in the political realm? Well, first you have a system with like the old, in the old days, maybe these kind of skull and bones organizations or these fraternal orders within these elite universities. There's some mechanism that lets people in and out. And then those who are approved, they're going to be tested for what they're good at. And a lot of times the person with the most aptitude may not be placed in the highest role. Maybe you don't elect that person as president. You put them somewhere in the middle where they can serve a better role, because sometimes the champion is not the best wrestler. A lot of times it's his opponent, because the opponent is the one that makes the champ look good. Or it could be these guys who know how to orchestrate a match to make the winner look like a real good winner, like a technical wrestler is what they would call them. So you have to understand that these kind of jobs exist at all levels of these political worlds as well. And you can tell by people's reactions to events that they're not clued in, because essentially we're at a very disrupted spot in the program. Now, some people think that like Donald Trump is a legit outsider in the fullest sense. This would be to say, like, what if a guy that's really good at beating people up just goes into the wrestling thing and at some point decides like, oh, I'm just gonna beat all the other people up and show them it's fake. Well, that's when somebody's gonna take you out back and eliminate you as a threat. They're gonna make sure that doesn't happen. But let's say that it does. Well, what's that's too destructive to the whole system. Now, it could be that people like Trump and Elon Musk are behaving that way, or it could be instead that Trump is the kind of guy who knows how the game works, and instead what he's doing is what they call a shoot. So the normal match is called a work. Everything is a work. It's called a job, and everything within the job is work. And the job is to lose, really. So the job is to lose, which requires more work on the part of the loser. The other guy gets the benefit of the win, but they both get paid. And the planned aspect of it is why it's a work. It's worked out and ahead of time. But sometimes a wrestler will decide to shoot, which means that they're going to go off script. They might say something crazy they weren't supposed to say, or they might legitimately attack the guy. And some crazy thing could happen, like he legitimately pins somebody, or somebody gets injured. Now, if somebody gets injured in a match, like let's say the guy who was supposed to win gets injured, the other guy, what he needs to do is get him in a hold or pin him and get the ref to count 1, 2, 3, get him out of there, so that it ends in a legitimate way. And then you can deal with the consequences of that afterwards, like the belt changes hands or whatever, but they'll rewrite the story to figure it out. So there are ways of incorporating reality into the fiction when it's not been planned for, but they want to try to be careful to control the limits of that. And so when you say like that it means it's fake, that's not true. It's not that it's fake. It means that the stated goals are different from the actual goals. And the people who are operating in certain ways are probably trying to accomplish something other than what they say they're trying to accomplish. And, you start to see this stuff when you see guys like Mike Pence just being totally sold out to the deep state or whatever. It's like, okay, at some point along the line, if his Christianity was legit or whatever, he's been compromised, he's been bought off. And so, this is where Epstein comes in. But the interesting thing really to see is the way that people react, because you see a whole bunch of people that are having different reactions, cheerful ones, actually treating it as if it is a kayfabe thing. And essentially they're like, yes, my side is winning. So you see the way that whole thing with Zelensky went down, and they're cheering it on. They're rooting it as entertainment. But then there's this whole other group of people that are basically, they don't realize that what they're saying is oh, this isn't right because the rules weren't being followed. And they don't even understand that they have bought into the political theater as being an honest thing, because they don't recognize the difference between real life. The idea that all politicians are supposed to be smart and respectful, that was fiction. That's always been fiction. So when you see people being like, oh, this guy's not presidential, I wish we had an Obama kind of somebody or whatever, or trying to say that Zelensky's the most fake guy of all. We know he's an actor. It doesn't mean he doesn't do real bad stuff. That's the thing. It's not that real people aren't hurt. It's just that it's a totally different game that's being played. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that this thing definitely has been prearranged? Whether that's what's happening right now, it's difficult to say. I think there's definitely some legitimate aspects of it, or at least there's some positive, legitimate changes that are being implemented into the process as it evolves for the internet age or whatever. And probably a lot of that is legit. They haven't figured out how to game things in this new system yet, with the internet, essentially. Because the mainstream media was totally like watching the in-ring commentary or whatever. It was all about perpetuating the narrative and not about reporting anything like the truth. It's difficult to say what's going on, and it's difficult to say about whether people really are thinking about it in terms of reality, or if it's still just people, rooting for different sides of a narrative. Now, this gets into the kind of depth psychology stuff with Jordan Peterson and these Jungian archetypes and these narrative mythologies, and how much of it is that we really see reality in those ways and that we're longing for it. As a Christian, a lot of that stuff is true. That's part of the way that God's wired us. We are willingly participating in the crafting of this narrative, and our faith is that God will bring the leaders to take the roles that we hope they fulfill, rather than the typical heels that we're tired of seeing. Those are some thoughts about this whole thing, just to probe a greater depth of how this thing goes, because it goes beyond fake. It's not that it's fake. That's a very low level take on the whole thing. It's very real what's going on, but what's unclear to most people, including myself, I would say, well, I think ultimately in the biblical sense you can say God is the one behind the final script, and he knows the final plays. And so as Christians, we have a hope that things will turn out in the end very well. But as to what happens in this current act of the story, it's difficult to say. And it's difficult to know what the true motives and intentions of the people playing this game are doing. But the one thing I would say is that you do have control over your role, and you can choose to be simply a spectator, to be a dupe, to be a mark, or you can try to enact some amount of change in the narrative, whether it's through your verbal support or the actions that you take. These things do have an impact, because while wrestling is scripted, it's the only sport where the audience can actually sway the outcome. So that's something to think about. Thank you.